Hello, and welcome to our Author Spotlight. I'm Eleanor Hayes. Joining me now is Rick Porrello. I am so intrigued by the series of your careers, from musician to a long career in law enforcement and then to a writer focusing on mob organized crime history in Cleveland. What's the story there?
I've been very fortunate. I've been blessed with success, and it all comes really as far as the interest in organized crime, curiosity about my own family history. My grandfather was a mob figure, an organized crime figure during the old bootlegging days of Prohibition back in the 20s and 30s. And he, along with three of his brothers, three of my uncles, they were killed. And so growing up many decades later as a boy, I would hear these little bits and pieces, and that sort of planted a seed as far as wanting to write about it and wanting to learn more about it, not necessarily write about it. And when I did learn more in later years, I realized that it was a huge story. And the history of the Porrello family in the 1920s and 1930s, these Sicilian immigrants, was really the history of the beginning of the mafia or traditional organized crime history in Cleveland.
So when some families want to learn more about their ancestors, they go to Ancestry.com or the library. Where did you do your research?
Actually, the wonderful public library was a huge help. Cleveland Public, Cuyahoga County, Cleveland State. At first I went to the newspaper archives, and back then they had reels of film, and you roll along, and the first thing I looked for was the story about the murder of my grandfather, and I didn't know if it would be an article on page 2, a small article. Well, it was front page headlines. It was huge. And that really cemented my curiosity to learn about what happened.
You've written a number of books. Your latest is Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. What specifically do you cover in this one?
Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes is the story of Chandra Burns, probably Cleveland's most notorious Jewish racketeer. So it's primarily about him, but in the background is the Italian mob and the black numbers racket, the whole numbers gambling, illegal lottery here in Cleveland. So there's a lot of different kinds of characters, Irish, Jewish, Italian, black, and I was just sort of fascinated by Chandra Burns as a character and the whole backdrop of the story. So I have high hopes for this story, not only the book, but potentially for cinematic adaptations.
The big screen, which brings us to something that many associate with you, and that is To Kill the Irishman.
Yes.
So tell us how your book ended up being on the big screen.
Well, it followed my first book, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, which was about my family, the Porrellos, and also the four Leonardo brothers, also Sicilian immigrants who came to Cleveland, and the Sugar War, as they call it. But after that book was published, commercially published by Barricade Books in New Jersey, I thought I was done. It took 9 years to get that book done, and I kept jokingly asking my new wife, when's that book going to get published? When's it going to get published? Finally, I found a publisher, Barricade Books, and they published the book, and I swore I would never do this again because there was so much involved. But when you're commercially published, the publisher sends you a case of books like hot off the press. Well, when I got that book in my hand, we had a bottle of champagne to celebrate, and I realized I had to do it again. And the next logical story, which I covered in the last few chapters of The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, was Danny Green, this fascinating Irish-American racketeer who went up against the well-established Cleveland mob in the 1960s and 1970s, and there was a bombing war, there was so much going on, and I was just fascinated by the story. So that became my next book. I self-published it. I wasn't happy with the royalty rate that commercial publishers typically give. So I self-published. There was an article in a newspaper, and there was a young producer by the name of Tommy Reed who went to Ohio State, and he had friends in Cleveland, and one of them sent him the article, newspaper article about this cop writing this book about Danny Green. And Tommy Reed was very interested in the story because he had Irish and Italian roots. He contacted me. I obtained the services of an agent, and that was it. It went into development. It was quite a few years that it was in development, and then was shot in 2009. And credit Tommy Reed and also Code Entertainment out in L.A. for marshaling that project through to the big screen.
What was it like when you sat in the theater, surrounded by hundreds of people who had no idea who you were, watching the movie?
Yeah. Well, before that happened, I was on the set in Detroit. Unfortunately, because of the film tax rebate back then, Detroit portrayed Cleveland, and it was just such a fascinating feeling of awe and excitement to see some of these scenes coming to life. Adapted scenes, they weren't, absolutely true to life. I always tell people, Kill the Irishman, the movie, is the Hollywood version of the story. Because some people get a little bit upset that things were changed a little bit, people that really know the story. But it was a very exciting moment when the movie finally came out and we had the premiere. There was a premiere in New York, we had a premiere here in Cleveland, and just a wonderful feeling of success that after all those years, that book was adapted for a motion picture.
As a writer, does it bother you when Hollywood has a different twist that may not be true to fact?
Of course it does. Yeah, absolutely. But I also realize there's nothing I can do about that. Unless I'm walking in, if you're an investor and you have $500,000 and I'm bringing you in as part of the package, maybe I'd have a little bit more control creatively. But I realize now that you don't. When you sell the rights to a screenplay or a book, short story, typically you're giving up that creative control. They don't want too many cooks in the kitchen, and they certainly don't want the original author in the kitchen. It's frustrating. It's frustrating, and like I said, so many people in Cleveland would ask me, why did they do this? This didn't happen. That didn't happen. And again, I just say it's like so many movies out there, like the vast majority of movies out there. It's the Hollywood version of the book, of the story.
A lot of people have good stories. Many people can write. So put those two together. Is it easy to make a career, a living, out of being an author in hopes of putting something on the big screen?
I've talked to so many would-be authors over the years, and it is tough. It's a gamble to, first of all, it's easier than ever to get a book published, but there's a lot of poorly written and poorly edited, maybe not even edited, not even proofread, books that are going out there because it's so easy to convert into an ebook, which makes it more difficult for professional writers for their books to be seen. So you got to work 3 times as hard. It's a gamble. It's like throwing a dice. But I tell people the number one aspiring authors: commitment and perseverance. You have to be committed to it. It's a lot of work, and you have to just persevere to get that book done. And then once it's done, you have to have a good editor. You have to have it proofread. If you want to put out a good product. And then from there, there's so many ways to get published. Commercial publishers, you could self-publish. There's online companies that will kind of do a little bit of both. You pay them a lump sum, and they take care of a lot of the little things that you typically, if somebody's writing one book, they don't want to deal with.
What do you think keeps the appetite whet, if you will, for the types of books that you write about mob history and organized crime? Why are we so intrigued by that?
I've made a nice sideline doing presentations about organized crime history, usually based on my last book. And after the presentation, maybe 45 minutes, we do a Q&A thing. And oftentimes I'm asked that question: why are people so interested in organized crime in general? And I think what it is as humans, the vast majority of us are kind of in the middle. We're somewhere in the middle. And then over to the right, there's the rich, the powerful, the famous. And over on the left, there's the murderers and serial rapists and serial serial killers and dredges of society. And we're hardwired to have a curiosity about both of those extremes. And I think that's why you see so many books and documentaries and stories about, the rich, the powerful, the famous, and the criminals on the other end.
We talked about your long career in law enforcement, including being the retired police chief in Lyndhurst. Due to your research, did you ever have some things go through your mind as the way you approached your job in law enforcement? Did you have a different insight?
Well, I felt that really, not so much an insight, but I felt that being a cop for 33 years, 23, the last 10, a little over 10, where I was the police chief. But prior to that, I was on the road, I was taking calls, I was doing investigations and interviewing a lot of people. And I always felt that police work made me a better writer, and that writing and interviewing people in the book writing setting made me a better cop. So they kind of, I guess you'd say, complemented each other, I always felt. Yeah.
As we watch for what's next for Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes, what else do you have in the works?
I am currently completing, I'm in editing on a book. The title is now locked in as There's More Bodies Out There. It is a quote, and is the story of a mobbed up serial killer in Pittsburgh. It's sort of it's where true crime meets organized crime. It's a fascinating story. There's a lot of layers to it. There's a bad cop, which kind of fascinated me as a police chief. And I have a lot of hope that it will have a wide audience. So I'm hoping that the book will be out in October or November.
Thank you very much, Rick Porrello, for sharing mob history, organized crime stories, and we continue to stay tuned.
Thank you, Eleanor.
We hope that you've enjoyed and learned from our talk with Rick. We look forward to your comments, and make sure to like and share.